That day was supposed to be a day of humiliation for a poor Jewish woman, but no one knew the plot twist that was about to happen. If you enjoy stories that reveal the true meaning of strength and dignity, I invite you to subscribe to our channel to see more inspiring tales like this one. Never judge someone's worth by their circumstances, because dignity isn't something money can buy or poverty can steal. Starity Taisiosik of the Palais Schwarzenberg stood like a monument to European grandeur against the Vienna night sky, its Baroque facades illuminated by spotlights that turned stone into gold. Inside the private Belvedere room, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of power and intrigue. Tonight, the room hosted 35 of Europe's most influential individuals, tech moguls, fashion dynasties, banking heirs, and business titans whose decisions shaped markets and destinies. At the head of the longest table sat Victor Steinberg, commanding attention without effort. At 42, he possessed the magnetic presence of a man who had never doubted his own importance. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the room with calculating precision, the gaze of someone who had built a financial empire from nothing, transforming a small Austrian investment firm into a multinational powerhouse worth billions. His tailored suit, worth more than most people earned in months, fit him like armor designed for conquest. Victor lived alone in a penthouse that overlooked all of Vienna, a deliberate choice that reflected his philosophy. Relationships were temporary, but power was eternal. He had never married, viewing romance as a weakness that successful men couldn't afford. Women came and went from his life like seasonal fashions, beautiful, expensive, and ultimately disposable. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Tonight we dine not just on Chef Laurent's cuisine, but on the sweet taste of absolute success. He raised his crystal glass of vintage wine. We are living proof that in this world everything has a price, if you know how to negotiate properly. The assembled guests murmured their agreement. These were people who spoke in the coded language of extreme wealth, where every statement carried layers of meaning calculated for maximum impact. They understood that dinners like this weren't about food. They were about reinforcing the networks that controlled nations. As the evening progressed through courses of molecular gastronomy, Victor found his attention drawn to the service staff moving through the room with practiced invisibility. These were the necessary ghosts of wealth, present but unseen, helpful but not human, essential but easily replaced. Among them moved Leah Goldberg, though her presence somehow defied the usual rules of invisibility that governed service in settings like this. At 26, she possessed a quiet dignity that no uniform could diminish. Her dark eyes held intelligence sharpened by hardship, and her movements carried grace born not from training, but from an inner strength that wealth couldn't understand or purchase. Leah had come to Vienna 18 months ago with nothing but hope and determination. Her family had fled economic collapse in Eastern Europe, and she had arrived speaking broken German, carrying credentials that meant nothing in her new country. The temporary employment agency had found her this catering job, not glamorous work but honest work that paid enough for a tiny shared apartment and small amounts sent home to family members who depended on her modest income. Unlike the other servers hired from Vienna's exclusive agencies, Leah worked for dignity rather than career advancement. Every plate she served, every glass she filled, was performed with the care of someone who understood that all honest work carried honor, regardless of how others might view it. Victor noticed her during the 3rd course. Something about her intrigued him. Perhaps it was how she didn't avoid eye contact like the other servers, or the slight accent that suggested a more complex story than her simple uniform implied. There was an untouchable quality about her that fascinated him, a dignity that seemed impervious to the casual contempt that wealth usually inspired in those who served it. Interesting, Victor murmured to Heinrich Weber, the German industrial heir seated beside him, nodding almost imperceptibly toward Leah. That one's different. Heinrich followed his gaze with bored attention. Different how? Looks ordinary to me. Exactly, Victor replied, his mind beginning to formulate an idea. Ordinary people fascinate me. They're so predictable in their desperation. As the meal progressed, Victor's companions engaged in their usual ritual of post-dinner boasting. Stories of recent conquests, business deals that had crushed competitors, acquisitions that demonstrated their distance from ordinary human concerns. It was during this familiar performance of wealth and ego that Victor's attention crystallized into what would become the evening's defining moment. He had been observing Leah throughout the service, noting her professionalism, her quiet grace, the way she seemed somehow separate from her circumstances. She represented a question that had begun to obsess him: whether everyone truly had a price, whether dignity itself could be purchased if the offer was substantial enough. In Victor's world, everything was transactional. Love was negotiated through prenups, loyalty was bought through bonuses, and respect was commanded through fear. He had built his fortune on the fundamental belief that every person would compromise their principles for the right amount of money. It was a philosophy that had never failed him, until tonight. "My friends," Victor said, rising from his chair with deliberate theatricality, "I propose we end this evening with a little social experiment." The room fell silent, recognizing the tone that preceded Victor's most audacious displays. These were the moments that would be discussed in exclusive circles for months, the stories that reinforced their collective superiority over those who struggled for what they casually discarded. "We all know that everyone has a price," Victor continued, his voice carrying false intimacy. "That's how we've built our empires, by understanding exactly what people want and how desperately they'll compromise to get it. But tonight, I want to test that theory under controlled conditions." The guests leaned forward with anticipation, sensing they were about to witness something that would either confirm their worldview or provide entertainment at someone else's expense. In their sphere, both outcomes were equally satisfying. Victor's gaze found Leah as she moved efficiently between tables, unaware that she was about to become the centerpiece of a game designed to prove that dignity was just another commodity for sale. His smile carried the cold satisfaction of a predator who believed he had found perfect prey. What Victor didn't know was that he was about to encounter something his billions couldn't buy, his influence couldn't control, and his cynicism couldn't understand. A soul that had been tested by real hardship and emerged unbreakable. A heart that had learned to find wealth in places where money had no power, and a spirit rooted in traditions that had survived millennia of persecution precisely because they valued what could never be purchased. The stage was set for a confrontation between two worlds, one that measured everything by its price, and another that understood some things were priceless. Tonight, Vienna's elite would learn that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one with the most money, but the one with nothing left to lose except their principles, and the wisdom to know those principles were worth more than any fortune. In the ancient Jewish tradition, there is a teaching: who is rich? One who is satisfied with their portion. Tonight, that wisdom was about to collide with a world that had forgotten what true satisfaction meant. Victor's announcement hung in the air like expensive perfume, intoxicating and artificial. The 35 most powerful people in Europe leaned forward in their gilded chairs, their eyes gleaming with the anticipation of wealthy predators about to witness fresh entertainment. In their world, boredom was the only true enemy, and Victor Steinberg had never disappointed when it came to providing spectacle at others' expense. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor continued, his voice carrying the theatrical confidence of a ringmaster about to unveil his most daring act, "tonight I want to conduct a small social experiment about human nature and, shall we say, financial incentives." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim leather wallet, extracting 3 identical black credit cards that caught the chandelier light like obsidian mirrors. The cards were sleek, unmarked, except for small platinum chips that suggested unlimited purchasing power. To the untrained eye, they represented the kind of financial freedom that most people only dreamed of, the ability to buy anything, anywhere, without question or consequence. What the assembled guests didn't know, what only Victor knew, was that these cards were connected to accounts with precisely 10,000 euros each, a substantial sum for ordinary people, certainly, but hardly the unlimited spending power he was about to promise. It was exactly the kind of cruel joke that Victor found amusing, offering what appeared to be everything while actually providing very little, then watching people debase themselves for an illusion. "The rules of my little game are simple," Victor announced, standing and beginning to pace around the table with the predatory grace of someone who had never doubted his own supremacy. "I'm going to select 3 women in this room and offer each of them one of these exclusive credit cards. No limits, no questions asked, no strings attached. They can spend whatever they wish, wherever they wish, for as long as they wish." Murmurs of fascination rippled through the crowd. Even among this gathering of the extraordinarily wealthy, the concept of truly unlimited spending held a certain mystique. These were people who calculated their purchases in millions, yet they all remembered what it felt like to want something they couldn't immediately afford. Victor's eyes scanned the room with the calculating precision of a jeweler, selecting stones for a particularly elaborate setting. His gaze settled first on Isabella Marchetti, the 28-year-old daughter of a Milan fashion dynasty who had been flirting with him throughout dinner. Isabella possessed the kind of sculpted beauty that came from a lifetime of professional styling, personal trainers, and subtle surgical enhancements. She wore a dress that cost more than most people's annual salaries, yet her eyes held the hungry look of someone who had never learned the difference between wanting and needing. "Isabella, my dear," Victor said with exaggerated gallantry, approaching her chair with one of the black cards extended like an offering. "Would you do me the honor of accepting this small token of my admiration?" Isabella's perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she reached for the card. "Victor, you can't be serious. Unlimited credit? Are you certain?" "Completely unlimited," Victor lied smoothly, enjoying the way her pupils dilated with avarice. "Consider it an investment in friendship." Isabella's laugh was breathless with excitement as she clutched the card against her chest. "This is incredible. I've been wanting to redecorate my apartment in Monaco, and there's this divine yacht I saw in Cannes." The second card went to Natasha Volkov, a Russian oligarch's ex-wife, whose divorce settlement had been calculated in billions, but who still maintained the acquisitive instincts of someone who remembered poverty. Natasha accepted the card with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to receiving expensive gifts from powerful men, though even her sophisticated composure cracked slightly at the promise of unlimited spending. "Natasha," Victor said, pressing the card into her palm with theatrical ceremony, "I trust you'll find some creative uses for this." "Oh, Victor," Natasha purred in accented English, her voice carrying the sultry gratitude of someone who understood exactly what kinds of favors such gifts typically required. "You are too generous. I know exactly how to appreciate such generosity." The third card was presented to Amélie Dubois, a French pharmaceutical heiress whose family fortune had been built on patents that kept life-saving medications expensive. Amélie possessed the kind of refined beauty that came from centuries of careful breeding and unlimited access to the world's finest luxuries. Yet beneath her cultured exterior lurked the same grasping hunger that Victor recognized in all truly wealthy people. The desperate need to have more, always more, regardless of how much they already possessed. "Amélie, enchanting as always," Victor said, offering the final card with a bow that somehow managed to be both respectful and mocking. "Perhaps this will help you with that art collection you mentioned." "Victor, you wonderful man," Amélie breathed, accepting the card with trembling fingers. "I've had my eye on a Monet that just came on the market. This is like a dream come true." The three women clustered together, examining their cards with the reverent attention usually reserved for religious artifacts. Their excitement was palpable, infectious, spreading through the room like a fever. Other guests began to murmur among themselves, some with envy, others with amusement at the spectacle of watching wealthy women become giddy over the prospect of spending someone else's money. Victor stood back and surveyed his handiwork with the satisfaction of a playwright watching his actors hit their marks perfectly. The three women were already planning their spending sprees, their voices rising with excitement as they discussed jewelry, real estate, art, and fashion. They had no idea that their unlimited cards would be declined after 10,000 euros, that their dreams of infinite consumption would crash against the reality of Victor's carefully orchestrated humiliation. But the evening's entertainment was far from over. As Victor watched the three women fawn over their cards, his attention drifted to the edges of the room where the service staff continued their work with professional invisibility. His eyes found Leah Goldberg as she quietly cleared plates from a nearby table, her movements efficient and graceful, her expression carefully neutral as she witnessed the display of wealth and excess surrounding her. A cruel idea began to form in Victor's mind, the kind of twisted inspiration that had always driven his most memorable entertainments. Why limit his experiment to wealthy women who could afford to lose 10,000 euros without consequence? Why not test his theory about universal greed on someone who actually needed money, someone whose desperation would make her capitulation even more satisfying to witness. "But wait," Victor announced loudly, his voice cutting through the excited chatter of the three women and their admirers. "I think our little experiment isn't quite complete yet." The room fell silent again, sensing that their host had prepared another act for their entertainment. Victor's smile carried the anticipatory pleasure of someone about to deliver a punchline that only he could see coming. His gaze fixed on Leah, who had frozen in the middle of stacking plates, suddenly aware that she had become the focus of 38 pairs of eyes. In her simple black uniform and practical shoes, she looked impossibly small and vulnerable, surrounded by so much wealth and power. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said, his voice dripping with false benevolence, "I believe our experiment would be incomplete without including someone who might actually appreciate such generosity." He reached into his wallet and withdrew a fourth black card, identical to the others, connected to the same limited account, carrying the same false promise of unlimited wealth. But this card wasn't intended as a gift. It was designed as a weapon, aimed at the dignity of a young woman whose only crime was being poor in a room full of people who had forgotten what poverty meant. "You there?" Victor called out, pointing directly at Leah with the casual arrogance of someone selecting livestock at market. "The server." "Yes, you. Come here." Leah's hands tightened on the plates she held, her knuckles whitening with tension. Every instinct told her to run, to escape whatever humiliation was about to unfold. But she needed this job desperately. Her family depended on the money she earned, and walking away from wealthy clients, no matter how offensive they became, wasn't a luxury she could afford. Slowly, with dignity that seemed to emanate from some source deeper than fear, Leah approached the table. Her steps were measured, controlled, revealing nothing of the storm of emotions brewing beneath her carefully composed exterior. "What's your name?" Victor asked, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care about the answer. "Leah," she replied quietly, her voice carrying the slight accent that marked her as an outsider in this room full of European aristocrats and business titans. "Leah," Victor repeated, savoring the name as if it were an exotic delicacy. "Beautiful name. Biblical, isn't it? How appropriate." A few guests chuckled at the obvious reference to her Jewish heritage, their laughter carrying the casual cruelty of people who had never experienced genuine persecution or hardship. Victor held up the fourth black card, letting it catch the light so everyone in the room could see it clearly. "Leah, my dear, I have a proposition for you. This card represents unlimited spending power. Anything you want, anywhere you want it, for as long as you want it. No questions, no restrictions, no consequences." The room held its collective breath, fascinated by the tableau unfolding before them. Here was their entertainment, watching a poor immigrant woman face the ultimate test of her principles against the overwhelming temptation of limitless wealth. "All you have to do," Victor continued, extending the card toward her like a serpent offering forbidden fruit, "is take it. Simple as that. One card, infinite possibilities. You could buy a house, travel the world, never worry about money again. You could send your family more money than they've ever seen. You could transform your entire life with one simple decision." Leah stared at the card, her dark eyes reflecting the chandelier light like pools of still water. The silence stretched between them, heavy with expectation and cruel anticipation. Everyone in the room leaned forward, waiting to witness what they assumed was inevitable. The moment when desperation would overcome dignity, when survival would triumph over principle, when poverty would bow to the promise of wealth. But something in Leah's expression suggested that Victor's carefully orchestrated humiliation might not unfold according to his script. Something in her stillness, her composure, her unblinking gaze, hinted at reserves of strength that unlimited money couldn't buy and unlimited cruelty couldn't break. In the ancient Jewish teaching of the Talmud, it is written, "Who is rich? One who is satisfied with their portion." Tonight, that wisdom was about to collide with a world that measured worth only in what could be purchased, possessed, and consumed. The silence in the Belvedere room stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with anticipation and cruel expectation. 38 pairs of eyes fixed on Leah Goldberg as she stood motionless before Victor's extended hand, the black credit card gleaming between them like a test of everything she had ever believed about herself, her values, and her place in the world. Victor's smile widened with predatory satisfaction. He had orchestrated this moment perfectly. The beautiful, desperate immigrant girl faced with more money than she could ever dream of earning through honest work. In his experience, desperation always won. Poverty always bowed to the promise of wealth. Principles were luxuries that disappeared when survival was at stake. "Take your time," Victor said with false magnanimity, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone offering charity to the deserving poor. "I understand this might be overwhelming. Most people in your situation have never been offered such an opportunity." The assembled guests leaned forward in their chairs, their faces reflecting the hungry anticipation of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. They were about to witness the inevitable capitulation of dignity to necessity, the moment when another soul would be purchased for the right price. It was a story they all knew well. They had written it themselves countless times in their business dealings, their political manipulations, their personal relationships. Leah's dark eyes remained fixed on the card, but something in her expression suggested she was seeing far beyond the piece of plastic that Victor held between them. Her breathing was steady, controlled, as if she were drawing strength from some source invisible to everyone else in the room. "Mr. Steinberg," Leah said finally, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that cut through the expectant silence like a blade through silk. "I appreciate your generous offer." Victor's smile faltered slightly at her tone. There was something wrong with this picture. Where was the breathless gratitude? The trembling hands reaching desperately for salvation, the tears of relief at being rescued from poverty. "But I must decline," Leah continued, her words falling into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to touch every corner of the opulent room. The collective gasp was audible. Several guests actually leaned back in their chairs as if physically struck by the impossibility of what they had just heard. In their world, no one, absolutely no one, refused free money. It violated every principle they understood about human nature, every lesson they had learned about the universal power of wealth. "I'm sorry," Victor said, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone who suspected he had misheard something important. "Did you say you're declining?" "Yes, sir," Leah replied, her composure absolute, despite the storm of emotions that must have been raging beneath her calm exterior. "I cannot accept your card." "Cannot?" Victor's voice rose slightly, his theatrical composure beginning to crack. "My dear girl, do you understand what you're refusing? This isn't some trivial amount. This card represents unlimited purchasing power. You could buy anything: houses, cars, jewelry, travel. You could send more money to your family than they've seen in their entire lives. You could transform your circumstances completely." Leah's slight smile carried a sadness that seemed to encompass not just her own situation, but the entire scene unfolding around her. The waste, the cruelty, the fundamental misunderstanding of what actually constituted wealth. "Mr. Steinberg," she said softly, "in my tradition we have a teaching. Who is rich? One who is satisfied with their portion. You offer me unlimited money, but what you're really offering is unlimited emptiness." The room erupted in confused murmurs. These were people who had devoted their entire lives to the pursuit of unlimited everything. Unlimited wealth, unlimited power, unlimited consumption. The concept of satisfaction with one's portion was not just foreign to them, it was actively threatening to everything they believed about success and happiness. "I work honestly for my money," Leah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Every euro I earn through my own effort, my own dignity. The money you offer comes with no effort, no achievement, no purpose. It would make me dependent on your generosity rather than my own strength." Victor's face was beginning to redden with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. This was not how his entertainment was supposed to unfold. The poor girl was supposed to grovel with gratitude, not deliver lectures on philosophy and dignity. "Furthermore," Leah said, turning slightly to address not just Victor but the entire room full of wealthy spectators, "accepting money from someone who offers it as sport, who views my poverty as entertainment for his friends, that would cost me something more valuable than anything money could buy." "And what's that?" Victor snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "My soul," Leah replied simply. The two words landed with the force of a physical blow. In the Jewish tradition from which Leah drew her strength, the soul was not just the spark of life, it was the connection to everything sacred, everything eternal, everything that gave existence meaning beyond material accumulation. "You see," Leah continued, her voice taking on the gentle authority of someone sharing wisdom passed down through generations of suffering and survival. My grandmother survived the Holocaust. She lost everything, her family, her home, her possessions, even her name for a time. But she told me something before she died that I have never forgotten. The room had fallen completely silent now, the kind of silence that accompanies the recognition that something profound is happening, something that cannot be dismissed or ignored. She said that they could take everything from her money, her belongings, even her freedom, but they could never take her dignity unless she chose to give it away. She said dignity is not something others can grant or remove. It comes from within, from knowing who you are and what you stand for, regardless of your circumstances. Leah paused, her gaze moving slowly across the faces of Europe's most powerful individuals, seeing them perhaps more clearly than they had ever seen themselves. Tonight you offer me money in exchange for my dignity. You want me to accept charity disguised as generosity, to play the role of the grateful poor person for your entertainment. But my dignity is not for sale. My soul is not for rent. And my principles are not negotiable regardless of the price offered. The silence that followed was different from the expectant quiet that had preceded her words. This was the silence of recognition, the uncomfortable acknowledgement that they had just witnessed something they had not expected and could not easily dismiss. Isabella Marchetti, who had been clutching her black card like a treasure, suddenly found herself staring at it with different eyes. The card that had seemed like a gift from the gods now felt heavy in her hands, tainted somehow by the understanding that it represented not generosity but manipulation, not freedom but dependency. Natasha Volkov shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her own card suddenly feeling less like a prize and more like evidence of her willingness to be purchased. She had accepted Victor's gift without question, without considering what it said about her character, her values, her own dignity. Amélie Dubois found herself wondering when she had stopped seeing gifts from powerful men as potential traps and started seeing them as entitlements. When had she lost the ability to question the motives behind generosity that came with unspoken strings attached? Victor stood frozen, his extended hand still holding the black card that had been rejected with such devastating finality. In his 42 years of life, he had never encountered someone who refused his money, his influence, his power. He had built his entire identity around the belief that everyone could be bought, that everything was for sale if you knew the right price. "You're making a mistake," Victor said finally, his voice carrying a desperate edge that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Leah. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You'll regret this decision for the rest of your life." Leah's smile was gentle but unshakable. "Mr. Steinberg, I would regret accepting your card for the rest of my life. I would regret compromising my values for money. I would regret allowing myself to be used as entertainment for people who see my struggles as amusing, but I will never regret choosing dignity over dollars, principles over purchasing power." She paused, looking directly into Victor's eyes with a steadiness that seemed to see straight through his wealth to the emptiness beneath. "In my faith, we believe that every person is created in the image of the divine. That means every person, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, possesses infinite worth that cannot be measured in money. You offer me unlimited credit, but you treat me as if I have no value beyond my willingness to accept your charity. That contradiction tells me everything I need to know about the true worth of your offer." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, smothering the laughter and excitement that had filled the air just moments before. The three women who had accepted their cards now sat in uncomfortable silence, each lost in thoughts they had not expected to have, questions they had not planned to ask themselves. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Steinberg," Leah said, with a small bow that somehow managed to be both respectful and final. "But some things in this world cannot be bought, and I am one of them." With that, she turned and walked away from Victor's extended hand, leaving him standing with his rejected card, while 37 of Europe's most powerful individuals sat in stunned silence, forced to confront a truth they had spent lifetimes avoiding: that real wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts, and true power came not from what you could buy, but from what you refused to sell. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is not fighting the system, but simply refusing to participate in it. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who walks away from what everyone else desperately wants. Have you ever stood up for your principles when it would have been easier to compromise? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Leah's situation? The silence that followed Leah's departure was not merely the absence of sound. It was the presence of profound discomfort, the weight of 37 guilty consciences suddenly forced to confront truths they had spent decades avoiding. Victor Steinberg stood frozen in the center of the Belvedere room, his extended hand still clutching the rejected credit card, his face cycling through emotions he had not experienced since childhood: confusion, shame, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine humility. For 42 years, Victor had lived by one unshakable principle: everything was for sale if you knew the right price. That belief had built his empire, shaped his relationships, and defined his understanding of human nature. It was not just his business philosophy, it was his religion, his science, his fundamental explanation for how the world worked. And in less than 5 minutes, a young Jewish woman in a server's uniform had shattered it completely. "Well," said Heinrich Weber finally, his voice carrying the forced joviality of someone desperately trying to restore normalcy to a situation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. "That was unexpected." A few nervous chuckles rippled around the table, but the laughter felt hollow, artificial, like applause at a performance that had gone terribly wrong. The assembled guests, titans of industry, inheritors of ancient fortunes, wielders of political influence, suddenly found themselves in the unfamiliar position of not knowing what to say or how to react. Victor slowly lowered his hand, the rejected credit card feeling heavier than it should have, as if it had absorbed some of the weight of his humiliation. He had orchestrated this evening to demonstrate his power over human nature, to prove his superiority over those less fortunate. Instead, he had been given a masterclass in dignity by someone he had assumed was powerless. "Fascinating," murmured Dr. Elizabeth von Habsburg, a descendant of Austrian royalty whose family had maintained their wealth through 8 centuries of careful political maneuvering. "I don't believe I've ever seen anyone refuse money before, not in our circles anyway." Her words hung in the air like an indictment. Our circles, the rarefied atmosphere of unlimited wealth where money was not just power, but the very air they breathed, the measure of all value, the answer to every question. What did it say about their world that refusing money was so shocking it rendered them speechless? Isabella Marchetti was staring at the black card in her manicured hands, as if seeing it for the first time. The piece of plastic that had seemed like a golden ticket just minutes before now felt different, tainted somehow, carrying implications she had been too excited to consider. The young woman who had just walked away from unlimited wealth had made Isabella's eager acceptance seem not just greedy but small. "Should we?" Isabella began hesitantly, then stopped, uncertain how to finish the sentence. Should they what? Acknowledge that they had just witnessed something remarkable? Pretend it hadn't happened? Continue with their evening as if nothing had changed? "Should we what?" Victor snapped, his embarrassment finally finding a target in Isabella's uncertainty. "Should we discuss the philosophical implications of servant-class morality? Should we analyze the psychology of poverty-induced delusion?" But even as he spoke the words, Victor could hear how hollow they sounded. This was his old self talking, the version of Victor Steinberg who had explanations for everything, who could reduce any human behavior to simple calculations of self-interest and financial desperation. That Victor had been confident, certain, unshakable in his cynicism. This Victor, the one standing in the aftermath of Leah's quiet revolution, was discovering that certainty could be as fragile as crystal, shattered by something as simple as an honest no. Natasha Volkov set her card down on the table with deliberate care, as if it might explode if handled roughly. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we should consider what just happened. That young woman had every reason to accept Victor's offer. She's obviously struggling financially. She could have changed her entire life with a single word, but she chose her principles instead." "Her principles," Victor repeated, his voice dripping with the disdain of someone desperate to restore his worldview to its familiar foundations. "Easy to have principles when you're young and naive. Wait until life teaches her that integrity doesn't pay rent or put food on the table." "But that's exactly the point," said Amélie Dubois, surprising herself with the words even as she spoke them. "She already knows that life is hard. She's obviously experienced poverty, struggle, probably discrimination, and still she chose dignity over dollars. That's not naivety, that's strength." The admission hung in the air like a confession, Amélie, who had built her identity around being practical, sophisticated, worldly, was acknowledging that she had just witnessed something she didn't fully understand but couldn't dismiss. Victor felt his carefully constructed reality continuing to crumble around him. These were his people, wealthy, cynical, transactional in their approach to human relationships. They were supposed to validate his worldview, to laugh at the foolish idealism of someone too poor to afford principles. Instead, they were treating Leah's refusal as if it meant something profound. "Don't romanticize poverty," Victor said sharply. "That girl will wake up tomorrow in the same circumstances she went to sleep in tonight. Still poor, still struggling, still invisible to people like us. Her principles won't pay her bills or improve her circumstances. In 6 months, when she's facing eviction or hunger, she'll remember this night and curse her own stupidity." But even as he spoke, Victor found himself remembering the look in Leah's eyes, not the desperate hunger he had expected to see, but something that looked remarkably like peace. It was an expression he had never seen in any mirror, despite owning everything money could buy. The conversation around the table had fractured into smaller discussions, the unified atmosphere of wealth and privilege splintering into individual discomfort. Some guests were defending Victor's original premise, that everyone had a price, that Leah's refusal was either performance art or temporary insanity. Others found themselves questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. "You know," said Marcus Bergman, a Swiss banking heir whose family had managed money for European royalty for 3 centuries, "my grandfather used to tell stories about clients who lost everything in the war but maintained their dignity throughout. He said those were the ones who always recovered, who rebuilt their lives from nothing because they had something inside that couldn't be destroyed by external circumstances." "Your grandfather was a romantic," Victor replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Dignity is a luxury that poor people tell themselves they can afford because they have nothing else." "Is it?" asked Dr. von Habsburg quietly. "Or is it the one thing that can't be taken away, only given away?" The question settled over the table like dust after an explosion, marking the moment when Victor's carefully orchestrated evening had transformed into something none of them had expected, a philosophical crisis that challenged the very foundations of their existence. Victor excused himself from the table, claiming he needed air but actually needing escape from the increasingly uncomfortable conversation that his own actions had triggered. He walked to the tall windows that overlooked Vienna, the city that had shaped him, that had taught him the rules by which he had lived his entire adult life. Below, the streets were filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives, people who worked for wages instead of collecting dividends, who worried about mortgage payments instead of tax shelters, who measured their worth in relationships and achievements rather than net worth and portfolio performance. For the first time in his life, Victor found himself wondering what that might feel like. The image of Leah Goldberg refused to leave his mind. Not her beauty, though she had possessed a quiet grace that was somehow more striking than the calculated perfection of the women he usually encountered, but her certainty. The absolute confidence with which she had made her choice, as if the decision had required no internal debate, no weighing of options, no calculation of consequences. Victor had built his fortune on reading people, on understanding their motivations, their weaknesses, their price points. But Leah had been completely opaque to him. She had operated according to principles he couldn't decode, values he couldn't quantify, a moral framework that seemed to exist independently of external circumstances. When he returned to the table, he found the mood had shifted dramatically. Isabella, Natasha, and Amélie were engaged in quiet conversation, their black cards lying unused between them, like forgotten props from a play that had ended badly. The other guests were finishing their drinks in uncomfortable silence, the evening's entertainment having transformed into something none of them quite knew how to process. "Victor," Isabella said as he approached, "we've been talking and we think perhaps we should return these cards." The statement hit Victor like a physical blow. Not only had his demonstration of power failed spectacularly, but now even his successful targets were rejecting his gifts. The women who had accepted his cards with gratitude were now questioning their own decisions, influenced by the moral example of someone they had probably never noticed before tonight. "Return them?" Victor said, his voice cracking slightly. "Why would you do that?" "Because," Natasha said slowly, as if working through the logic even as she spoke, "accepting them now feels different. That young woman made us see these cards for what they really are. Not gifts, but purchases. You weren't being generous, you were buying something from us. Our gratitude, our sense of obligation, our willingness to play roles in your entertainment. And what's wrong with that? Victor asked desperately. It's how the world works. Everyone benefits. You get money to spend, I get the satisfaction of being generous. No one is harmed. No one except our dignity, Amelie said quietly. That's what she was trying to tell us, wasn't it? That some things are more valuable than money, and once you sell them, you can never get them back. The three women placed their cards on the table in front of Victor, the black plastic reflecting the chandelier light, like mirrors showing him his own reflection, and forcing him to confront what he had become in his relentless pursuit of wealth and power. Victor looked around the table at the faces of people who had been his peers, his validation, his confirmation that his worldview was correct. Now they were looking at him with something that might have been pity, and he realized that his demonstration of superiority had instead revealed his emptiness. The evening ended, not with the triumphant proof of human greed that Victor had planned, but with 37 of Europe's most powerful individuals filing out of the Palais Schwarzenberg in thoughtful silence, each carrying with them the memory of a young woman who had possessed something they were beginning to realize they had lost along the way, the knowledge that some things cannot and should not be bought. Victor remained alone in the Belvedere room long after the last guest had departed, surrounded by the detritus of wealth and privilege, holding 4 rejected credit cards and facing the uncomfortable realization that his entire understanding of human nature might have been fundamentally flawed. For the first time in decades, Victor Steinberg, master of the universe, builder of financial empires, manipulator of markets and men, didn't know what to do next. The only thing he knew with certainty was that he couldn't stop thinking about the quiet dignity of a young Jewish woman who had walked away from everything he had to offer, carrying with her a wealth he was only beginning to understand he had never possessed. Sometimes the most powerful people are revealed to be the most powerless, and the most powerless are revealed to possess a strength that no amount of money can buy or corruption can destroy. What do you think about Victor's reaction? Have you ever had a moment when someone challenged your entire worldview? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. 3 sleepless nights had passed since the dinner at Palais Schwarzenberg, and Victor Steinberg found himself in the unfamiliar territory of genuine introspection. He sat in his penthouse office overlooking Vienna, surrounded by the monuments to his success, awards, photographs with world leaders, original artworks worth millions, yet feeling emptier than he had ever felt in his life. The city spread out below him like a circuit board of lights and possibilities, but all he could think about was a young woman who had walked away from everything he had built his identity around offering. Victor had spent decades perfecting the art of not thinking too deeply about anything that might challenge his worldview. Successful businessmen, he had learned, were decisive rather than contemplative, practical rather than philosophical. But Leah Goldberg had shattered that comfortable superficiality with a few quiet words about dignity and the soul, forcing him to confront questions he had spent his adult life avoiding. The rejection haunted him, not because his pride was wounded, though it certainly was, but because it had revealed something about himself that he had never recognized. For the first time in his life, Victor was forced to see himself through someone else's eyes, and the reflection was profoundly disturbing. He had offered Leah what he considered the ultimate gift: unlimited purchasing power, the ability to buy anything she desired, freedom from the financial struggles that obviously constrained her life. In his experience, such an offer was irresistible, yet she had refused it not with regret or difficulty, but with a certainty that suggested she possessed something more valuable than what he was offering. What did she have that he lacked? What source of strength allowed her to walk away from material security with such grace? And why did her refusal feel less like rejection and more like an invitation to examine the fundamental assumptions that had guided his entire existence? Victor had built his fortune on understanding people, reading their desires, identifying their weaknesses, calculating the precise combination of pressure and incentive needed to make them act according to his wishes. But Leah had been completely opaque to him, operating according to principles that seemed to exist independently of self-interest or material calculation. Unable to concentrate on the financial reports and investment analyses that normally consumed his attention, Victor found himself researching something he had never bothered to understand before: the Jewish experience in modern Europe. He discovered histories of persecution and resilience, stories of communities that had maintained their identity and values despite centuries of oppression, accounts of individuals who had chosen death over compromise when their fundamental beliefs were threatened. It was during this unlikely education that Victor began to understand something crucial about Leah's refusal. She hadn't rejected his offer because she was naive or impractical. She had rejected it because she possessed a framework for understanding worth that transcended material considerations. Her dignity wasn't a luxury she could afford despite her poverty. It was a necessity she maintained because of what poverty had taught her about what truly mattered. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. If Leah was right, if dignity, principles, and spiritual integrity were more valuable than financial security, then Victor had spent 42 years accumulating the wrong kind of wealth while neglecting the acquisition of anything that actually mattered. After 3 days of restless contemplation, Victor made a decision that would have been impossible just a week earlier. He was going to find Leah Goldberg and apologize to her. Not the calculated apology of a businessman managing his reputation, but the genuine remorse of someone who had finally recognized the magnitude of his moral blindness. The search began with the catering company that had provided service for the dinner. Victor's initial approach was characteristically direct and presumptuous. He called the company's owner and demanded Leah's contact information, expecting his wealth and influence to grant him immediate access to whatever he wanted. "I'm sorry, Mr. Steinberg," said Anna Mueller, the company's founder, "but I cannot give out personal information about our employees. It's a matter of policy." "Ms. Mueller," Victor replied, with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child, "I'm not asking for state secrets. I simply need to contact one of your servers about a personal matter. Surely you can make an exception." "I'm afraid not, sir. Our employees trust us to protect their privacy. Many of them work multiple jobs or come from difficult circumstances. We don't compromise that trust, regardless of who is asking." Victor's first instinct was to apply pressure, financial incentives, business threats, the full weight of his influence. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of Leah's quiet dignity, or perhaps it was the beginning of an understanding that not everything could be obtained through force or manipulation. "Ms. Mueller," Victor said, his tone shifting from demand to request, "I understand your position and I respect it, but I need you to know that I behaved badly toward your employee and I want to make amends. Could you at least tell me if she's well? If she's still working?" There was a long pause before Anna replied, and Victor could hear the careful consideration in her voice. "Mr. Steinberg, I don't know what happened at your event, but Leah came to work the next day deeply troubled. She's a good person, one of our most reliable employees. If you hurt her in some way, I'm not inclined to help you find her." The accusation hit Victor like a physical blow, but it was accurate enough that he couldn't dismiss it with his usual arrogance. He had hurt Leah, not physically, but in ways that were perhaps more damaging. He had attempted to reduce her to a prop in his demonstration of power, had tried to purchase her dignity for the entertainment of his wealthy friends. "You're right," Victor admitted, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I did hurt her and I'm ashamed of my behavior. That's exactly why I need to apologize to her personally. Ms. Miller, I'm not asking you to trust me. I haven't earned that trust. But would you be willing to deliver a message to Leah on my behalf?" After another long pause, Anna agreed to consider passing along a letter if Victor would write one explaining his intentions. It was a small concession, but it represented something Victor had never experienced before: earning trust rather than demanding compliance. That evening, Victor sat at his mahogany desk, the same desk where he had signed billion-dollar deals and orchestrated corporate takeovers, and attempted to write something he had never written before: an honest apology that acknowledged wrongdoing without making excuses. The first draft was terrible, full of business jargon and emotional manipulation disguised as sincerity. The second was worse, a transparent attempt to portray himself as the victim of his own success and social expectations. It took Victor 7 attempts before he managed to write something that approached genuine contrition. "Dear Ms. Goldberg, my name is Victor Steinberg, and I owe you an apology that I doubt any words can adequately express. 3 nights ago at the dinner you served at Palais Schwarzenberg, I behaved in a manner that was cruel, thoughtless, and fundamentally wrong. I attempted to use you as entertainment for my guests, offering you money not as genuine generosity, but as a test of your character, designed to amuse wealthy people who have forgotten what character actually means. I treated you as if your dignity was for sale, as if your circumstances made you less worthy of respect than anyone else in that room. You responded to my cruelty with a grace and wisdom that has haunted me ever since. Your refusal to accept my offer wasn't just a rejection of money. It was a lesson in what true strength looks like, what real wealth consists of, and what it means to possess something that cannot be bought or sold. I don't expect forgiveness, I haven't earned it, but I wanted you to know that your words have started a process of questioning and self-examination that I should have begun decades ago. You showed me that dignity isn't determined by bank accounts, that worth isn't measured in possessions, and that the most powerful person in any room might be the one with the least to lose and the most to teach. If you would be willing to meet with me, not because I have any right to ask such a thing, but because I believe I have much to learn from someone who possesses the kind of strength I've never developed, I would be deeply grateful for the opportunity. With respect and remorse, Victor Steinberg. Victor sealed the letter before he could revise it again, knowing that further editing would only dilute the honesty that had taken him so long to achieve. He delivered it personally to Anna Mueller the next morning, along with a donation to a refugee assistance program that Anna mentioned her company supported. "This isn't payment for delivering my letter," Victor clarified, as Anna looked at the check with surprise. "It's an attempt to do something constructive instead of destructive for once. Whether Leah agrees to see me or not, I want to contribute to work that actually helps people rather than exploiting them." Anna studied Victor's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to distinguish between genuine contrition and skilled manipulation. "I'll give her your letter," she said finally. "What she does with it is entirely up to her." The waiting that followed was unlike anything Victor had experienced. In business, he was accustomed to controlling timelines, pressuring for quick decisions, using his influence to accelerate outcomes according to his preferences. But now he was completely at the mercy of someone else's choice, dependent on the decision of a person he had wronged and who owed him nothing. 2 days passed without response. Victor found himself checking his phone obsessively, starting at every notification, hoping for some indication that Leah had read his letter and was considering his request. The uncertainty was maddening for someone who had spent decades engineering certainty through wealth and power. On the 3rd day, his phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Steinberg." The voice was soft, careful, instantly recognizable despite the distance and distortion of the phone connection. "Ms. Goldberg," Victor said, his heart racing in a way that million-dollar negotiations had never induced. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure. I hoped you might, but I wasn't certain." "I read your letter," Leah said simply. "It was unexpected." "In what way?" "In Vienna, powerful men don't usually apologize to serving girls, especially not for behavior they probably consider normal." The observation stung because it was accurate. Victor had spent his life surrounded by people who would have viewed his treatment of Leah as unremarkable, perhaps even amusing. The fact that he now found his own behavior shameful represented a fundamental shift in his moral framework. "Ms. Goldberg," Victor said carefully, "would you be willing to meet with me? Not at some expensive restaurant or exclusive venue, somewhere you choose, somewhere you're comfortable. I want to apologize properly, and I want to understand how you developed the strength to walk away from what most people would consider a life-changing opportunity." There was a long pause before Leah replied. "Mr. Steinberg, why does this matter to you? You have everything money can buy. You live in a world where my opinion is irrelevant and my circumstances are invisible. Why do you care what one poor Jewish girl thinks about dignity and principles?" The question cut to the heart of Victor's confusion about his own motivations. Why did this matter to him? Why couldn't he simply dismiss Leah's refusal as the misguided idealism of someone too inexperienced to understand how the world really worked? "Because," Victor said slowly, working through the answer even as he spoke it, "you have something I don't have, and for the first time in my life I'm not sure money can buy it. You have peace with yourself. You have certainty about what matters. You have strength that doesn't depend on external circumstances. And I'm beginning to realize that despite everything I've accumulated, I've never possessed any of those things." Another pause then. "There's a small cafe in the 2nd district called Goldene Zeit. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock. I'll be there for 30 minutes. If you come alone and come prepared to listen rather than talk." The line went silent, leaving Victor holding his phone and staring out at a city that suddenly looked different, less like a conquest to be achieved and more like a mystery to be understood. Sometimes the most successful people are the most lost, and sometimes the path to finding yourself begins with acknowledging how completely you've been found wanting by someone who owns nothing but possesses everything that matters. Have you ever met someone who made you question everything you thought you knew about success and happiness? What did that encounter teach you about what truly matters in life? Goldene Zeit occupied a narrow corner building in Vienna's second district, wedged between a used bookstore and a small synagogue that had survived both world wars through a combination of luck, community protection, and divine providence. The cafe's windows were fogged with steam from espresso machines and the breath of afternoon conversations, creating an atmosphere of intimate warmth that felt like a refuge from the broader city's imperial grandeur. Victor arrived 15 minutes early, driven by a nervousness he hadn't experienced since his first job interview decades ago. He had spent the morning changing clothes repeatedly, unsure of the appropriate attire for apologizing to someone whose dignity you had attempted to purchase. Eventually, he settled on simple dark trousers and a navy sweater, the most understated outfit he owned, though even his casual clothes carried the subtle markers of expensive tailoring. The cafe's interior reflected the kind of authentic character that Vienna's wealthier districts had long since polished away in favor of tourist-friendly elegance. Mismatched chairs surrounded small wooden tables, scarred by years of use, their surfaces bearing the ghostly rings of countless coffee cups. The walls displayed local artwork, alongside faded photographs of the neighborhood's history, creating a sense of continuity that connected past and present in ways Victor's sterile penthouse never had. He chose a table near the window, positioning himself so he could see the street while remaining partially obscured by the cafe's eclectic decor. As 3 o'clock approached, Victor found himself watching each passerby with heightened attention, realizing he knew almost nothing about Leah beyond her work uniform and her remarkable capacity for refusing what others desperately desired. At exactly 3 o'clock, Leah Goldberg entered Goldene Zeit with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there. She wore a simple brown coat over dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical style that emphasized the intelligence in her dark eyes rather than any attempt at fashion. She carried a worn leather satchel that looked like it had traveled many miles and contained many stories. Victor stood as she approached his table, uncertain of the proper protocol for greeting someone you had recently attempted to humiliate. Leah solved his dilemma by extending her hand in a firm handshake that was neither warm nor cold, professional, direct, and entirely without artifice. "Mr. Steinberg," she said, as they seated themselves across from each other. "Thank you for your letter. It was more honest than I expected." "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Victor replied, suddenly aware of how his usual conversational confidence had deserted him entirely. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Leah admitted, signaling the waitress for coffee with the easy familiarity of a regular customer. "But my grandmother used to say that sometimes the people who hurt us have the most to teach us, not because they're wise, but because they force us to examine why we make the choices we make." The waitress appeared with practiced efficiency, setting down 2 cups of coffee that smelled rich and strong, nothing like the elaborate beverages Victor was accustomed to in Vienna's more fashionable establishments. Leah added sugar with the careful attention of someone who understood that small pleasures should be savored rather than rushed. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Victor said, genuinely curious about the family influences that had shaped someone capable of such moral clarity. "She was," Leah replied, her expression softening with memory. "She survived things that should have destroyed her faith in humanity, but instead, they taught her how to recognize what was truly valuable. She used to say that persecution shows you who you really are, not who you pretend to be, not who you wish you were, but who you actually are when everything else is stripped away." Victor found himself leaning forward, drawn into a conversation unlike any he had experienced in his adult life. In his world, personal history was either leverage to be exploited or weakness to be concealed. But Leah spoke of her grandmother's suffering with a reverence that transformed trauma into wisdom. "She came here after the war with nothing," Leah continued, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone sharing sacred stories. No money, no possessions, no family except my grandfather, who had also lost everything. But she told me they were the richest people in Vienna because they had survived with their souls intact. Their souls, Victor repeated, remembering how Leah had used that word at the dinner, how it had cut through his cynicism like truth through pretense. In our tradition, the soul isn't just what makes you alive, it's what makes you human. It's the part of you that connects to something larger than your own desires, your own fears, your own circumstances. My grandmother said that people could take everything from you except your soul, but only if you refused to sell it. Victor felt the weight of recognition settling in his chest. And you think I was trying to buy yours, weren't you? Leah asked without accusation, simply curious about his motivations. You offered me money not because I needed it, though I do, but because you wanted to prove that everyone has a price. You wanted to demonstrate that dignity, principles, faith, that these things are just luxuries that disappear when real money is offered. The accuracy of her assessment was devastating, but Victor found he couldn't retreat into his usual defensiveness. Something about Leah's directness, her lack of judgment despite having every right to condemn him, created space for honesty he had rarely allowed himself. Yes, he admitted, that's exactly what I was trying to do. In my world, everything is negotiable. Love, loyalty, respect, they're all just variables in complex equations. I've never met anyone who couldn't be bought, and I assumed you would be the same. And now? Victor was quiet for a long moment, studying Leah's face as she waited patiently for his answer. There was something about her stillness that suggested she was accustomed to silence, comfortable with the spaces between words where truth often lived. Now I'm beginning to think I've been measuring the wrong things, Victor said finally. I've spent 42 years accumulating wealth, power, influence, all the markers of success that our society values. But sitting across from you, I realize I don't possess anything that can't be taken away by market forces or economic collapse or simple bad luck. Leah nodded, as if she had been waiting for him to reach this conclusion. My grandmother used to say that there are two kinds of wealth, the kind that depends on external circumstances and the kind that grows stronger under pressure. She chose the second kind, and she taught me to choose it too. How? Victor asked, leaning forward with the intensity of someone seeking salvation. How do you choose strength over security? How do you walk away from material comfort in favor of, what? Abstract principles? For the first time since entering the cafe, Leah smiled. Not the polite social expression Victor was accustomed to receiving, but something genuine and unguarded that transformed her entire face. They're not abstract to me, she said. My principles are what allow me to sleep peacefully in a small shared apartment while you struggle with insomnia in a penthouse. My faith is what gives me purpose serving coffee and clearing plates, while you search for meaning in acquiring companies and manipulating markets. The observation was accurate enough to sting, but Victor found himself more curious than offended. What gives you that purpose? What makes serving in restaurants feel meaningful? Leah was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as she considered how to explain something that was fundamental to her existence, but foreign to his experience. I write, she said simply, stories about my people, about the communities we've built and lost and rebuilt, about the traditions that have kept us connected across centuries of diaspora and persecution, about the ordinary people who have done extraordinary things simply because they refused to abandon their values. Victor felt something shift in his understanding of the woman sitting across from him. You're a writer. I'm many things, Leah replied with gentle humor. I'm a server, a daughter, a granddaughter of survivors, a keeper of stories that might otherwise be forgotten. But yes, I write. Every morning before my shift, every evening after work, every moment I can steal between the demands of survival. What kind of stories? Leah's expression grew more animated, her voice taking on the passion of someone discussing their deepest calling. Stories about resilience, about communities in Eastern Europe that maintained their identity despite centuries of oppression, about families who preserved their traditions even when practicing them meant risking their lives, about the small acts of courage that allowed entire cultures to survive when empires tried to erase them. She reached into her leather satchel and withdrew a slim notebook, its pages filled with handwriting in multiple languages, German, Hebrew, what Victor assumed was Yiddish based on the familiar yet foreign script. This is just one of many, Leah said, handling the notebook with the care of someone touching something precious. I collect stories from elderly people in the community, survivors and their children, who remember what was lost and what was saved. I write about their experiences, not because they're famous or powerful, but because they represent something more valuable than fame or power. What's that? Continuity, Leah said simply. The understanding that we are links in a chain that extends backward through history and forward into the future. That our choices matter not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. That dignity and faith and love are not abstract principles. They're practical tools for building communities that can survive anything. Victor found himself staring at the notebook as if it contained secrets he had spent his life trying to unlock. Have you published any of your writing? Leah's laugh was self-deprecating but not bitter. Published? Mr. Steinberg, I work 3 jobs to afford a shared apartment in one of Vienna's less fashionable districts. Publishing requires connections, agents, marketing budgets, things that exist in your world, not mine. But that doesn't make the stories less important or the writing less necessary. The casual dismissal of fame and recognition as measures of worth was so foreign to Victor's experience that he struggled to process it. In his world, unpublished writing was equivalent to failed writing. Unmarketable art was worthless art. But Leah spoke about her stories as if their value was intrinsic rather than dependent on external validation. Could I? Victor began, then stopped, uncertain how to make the request without sounding patronizing. Would you be willing to share some of your writing with me? Not because I have connections in publishing, though I do, but because I think I need to understand how someone finds meaning in preserving stories rather than accumulating wealth. Leah studied his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to distinguish between genuine interest and calculated manipulation. Why does this matter to you, Mr. Steinberg? What are you really looking for? The question forced Victor to confront motivations he hadn't fully examined. What was he looking for? Absolution for his behavior at the dinner? Understanding of how someone could possess such certainty about intangible values, or something deeper, a glimpse of a way of living that might fill the emptiness he had never acknowledged existed? I think, Victor said slowly, I'm looking for what you have. Peace with yourself, certainty about what matters, strength that doesn't depend on bank accounts or stock portfolios. I've spent my entire adult life building wealth, but I've never built a life. And watching you walk away from everything I thought was valuable has made me realize that maybe I've been building the wrong thing entirely. Leah was quiet for a long time, studying Victor's face as if reading a text, written in a language she was still learning to decipher. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a gentleness that Victor had never heard directed toward him. Mr. Steinberg, what you're looking for isn't something I can give you. It's something you have to choose every day, in small decisions that nobody else will ever see or celebrate. It's choosing integrity when dishonesty would be profitable. It's choosing service when selfishness would be easier. It's choosing faith when cynicism would be more comfortable. She paused, then added with a slight smile, but if you're genuinely interested in understanding how stories can be more valuable than stock certificates, I suppose I could share some of my writing with you. As they arranged to meet again the following week, Victor realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of attraction, value, and desire. For the first time in his life, he was drawn to someone not for their beauty or status or utility, but for the quality of their character, the depth of their convictions, and the richness of their inner life. Leah Goldberg possessed something that no amount of money could purchase, a soul that had been tested by hardship and emerged unbroken, a heart that had learned to find wealth in places where his balance sheets registered only poverty, and a mind that understood stories were sometimes more valuable than stock portfolios because they preserved what money could never buy, the essence of what it meant to be fully, authentically, courageously human. Sometimes we meet people who show us not who we are, but who we could become. Sometimes the greatest luxury is not what we can afford to buy, but what we can afford to become. Have you ever met someone whose values completely challenged your own? How did that encounter change your perspective on what truly matters in life? 2 months had passed since Victor's first awkward apology at Golden Insight, and the cafe had become their regular meeting place, a neutral ground where a billionaire and a writer could sit as equals, sharing stories over coffee that cost less than Victor used to spend on single bottles of wine. The transformation in Victor during those 8 weeks had been profound, visible not just in his simpler clothing and quieter demeanor, but in the quality of his attention when Leah spoke about her writing, her family, her faith. Today, Victor carried with him a manila folder containing photocopies of Leah's handwritten stories, tales she had finally agreed to share after weeks of cautious trust-building. He had spent the previous night reading them by lamplight in his penthouse, surrounded by expensive art and luxury furnishings that had suddenly felt hollow and meaningless compared to the richness of Leah's words. The stories were unlike anything Victor had ever encountered in his world of financial reports and business analyses. They possessed a depth and authenticity that made him understand why Leah considered them more valuable than money. Each narrative was a window into lives shaped by suffering, but not broken by it. Communities held together by faith rather than wealth. Individuals who had found meaning in service rather than accumulation. One story in particular had moved Victor to tears, something he couldn't remember experiencing since childhood. It told of an elderly Jewish baker in a small Eastern European town who had continued to bake bread during a brutal winter siege, sharing his meager flour with neighbors even when his own family was hungry. The baker had died before the siege ended, but his bread had kept 7 families alive long enough to see spring. "It's just a story about bread," Leah had said when Victor asked about its origins. "But my grandmother told me it was really a story about choosing to give life rather than preserve it, about understanding that we're only as wealthy as our capacity to enrich others." Now, sitting across from Leah in their familiar corner of Golden Zeit, Victor struggled to find words adequate to express what her writing had awakened in him. "Leah," he began, his voice carrying an intensity that made her look up from her coffee with concern. "Your stories, they're extraordinary. They're not just well written, though they're necessary. They preserve something that the world desperately needs to remember." Leah's expression was cautious, alert to the possibility that Victor's praise might be leading towards some business proposition or attempt to commodify her work. "Thank you," she said simply, "but they're just stories, Victor. Tales that old people tell to keep memories alive." "No," Victor said firmly, leaning forward with the conviction of someone who had finally understood something crucial. "They're blueprints, instructions for how to be human in a world that's forgotten what humanity means. They're proof that dignity and love and faith aren't abstract concepts. They're practical tools for building communities, for creating meaning, for transforming suffering into strength." He paused, searching Leah's face for signs of understanding. "I've spent my entire adult life accumulating things, money, property, influence, but your stories made me realize that all of my acquisitions combined haven't contributed as much to human welfare as one baker sharing his flour with hungry neighbors." Leah was quiet for a long moment, studying Victor with the careful attention of someone trying to determine whether the transformation she was witnessing was genuine or performance. 2 months of conversation had shown her sides of Victor that probably no one else had ever seen. Vulnerability, genuine curiosity, a hunger for meaning that all his wealth had never satisfied. "Victor," she said finally, "what are you really asking me?" The question cut to the heart of Victor's confusion about his own motivations. What was he asking? Over the past 8 weeks, his feelings for Leah had evolved from curiosity to admiration to something deeper and more complex, something he was almost afraid to name. "I'm asking you to let me help," Victor said, then immediately backtracked as he saw Leah's expression shift toward wariness. "Not with money, not the way I've always helped before by throwing resources at problems, but with purpose. Your stories deserve to be preserved, published, shared with people who need to remember that there are different ways to measure wealth." "And what would you gain from that?" Leah asked, her tone carrying the gentle skepticism of someone who had learned that powerful people rarely acted without expecting returns on their investments. Victor was quiet for a long time, wrestling with an answer that required a level of honesty he had never offered another human being. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I would gain the chance to be part of something that matters," he said. "For 42 years, I've built an empire that serves no purpose beyond making me richer and more powerful. My buildings house people who can afford expensive rent. My investments generate profits for wealthy shareholders. My philanthropy buys tax deductions and social recognition. None of it makes the world better in any meaningful way." He paused, meeting Leah's eyes directly. "But your stories, they preserve wisdom. They honor people who lived with dignity despite impossible circumstances. They teach lessons about what it means to choose love over fear, service over selfishness, faith over cynicism. If I could help bring those stories to people who need to hear them, maybe my life would finally serve some purpose beyond accumulating wealth. Leah studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a text in a foreign language, searching for meanings that might be hidden beneath surface expressions. "Victor, are you sure that's all you're asking for?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Victor had been avoiding for weeks, but could no longer ignore. His feelings for Leah had grown beyond admiration for her character, beyond respect for her principles. He had fallen in love, not with her beauty, though she possessed a quiet grace that had become increasingly dear to him, but with her soul, her strength, her absolute commitment to values he was only beginning to understand. "No," Victor admitted, his voice shaking slightly with the vulnerability of complete honesty. "That's not all I'm asking for." Leah waited patiently, her expression neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply present and attentive in the way that had drawn Victor to her from their first conversation. "I'm asking for the chance to learn from you," Victor continued, the words coming in a rush now that he had committed to honesty. "I'm asking for the opportunity to become someone worthy of your respect, your friendship, possibly more than that. I'm asking you to consider whether a man who has lived entirely for himself can learn to live for something larger, something better." He paused, then added with painful self-awareness, "I'm asking you to take a chance on someone who has never given anyone else reason to trust him, who has treated relationships as transactions and people as commodities. I'm asking for something I've never asked for before and probably don't deserve, a second chance to be human." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet that had marked their previous conversations. This silence was charged with possibility and risk, with the weight of decisions that would shape both their futures. "Victor," Leah said softly, "are you asking me to fall in love with you?" The direct question took Victor's breath away, but it also clarified something that had been building in his heart for weeks. "Yes," he said simply, "I suppose I am. Not because I think I can buy your affection or manipulate your emotions, but because somewhere in the process of learning to see myself through your eyes, I've fallen in love with you. Completely, helplessly, in ways I never thought I was capable of." Leah was quiet for so long that Victor began to fear he had destroyed the fragile trust they had built over 2 months of careful conversation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of wonder and concern. "Victor, do you understand what you're saying? I'm not like the women you've known. I don't come from wealth or influence. I work multiple jobs to afford a shared apartment. I measure success by how well I preserve my grandmother's stories, not by how much money I accumulate. My dowry would be a collection of handwritten notebooks and an unshakable faith in values that your world considers naive." "I know," Victor replied without hesitation. "That's exactly why I love you. You possess everything I've been missing. Purpose, peace, principles that guide your decisions. You've taught me that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the richness of one's character, the depth of one's relationships, the significance of one's contributions to human welfare." He paused, then added with a smile that transformed his entire face, "Besides, I have enough money for both of us. What I need from you isn't financial contributions. It's moral guidance, spiritual wisdom, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure rather than weaker." Leah's own smile was tentative but genuine. "Victor, if I were to consider, what would that look like? A billionaire and a refugee writer, a man who measures everything in euros and a woman who measures everything in stories. It would look like 2 people learning from each other," Victor replied with growing confidence. "It would look like using wealth as a tool for service rather than accumulation. It would look like preserving stories and building communities and choosing love over fear every single day. It would look like me finally understanding what my grandmother meant when she said real wealth comes from what you give, not what you take." Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened with the careful attention of 2 people who understood they were building something precious and fragile. Victor began liquidating some of his more ethically questionable investments, redirecting his wealth toward projects that served genuine human needs rather than merely generating profit. Leah allowed him to help establish a small publishing initiative dedicated to preserving immigrant stories and refugee experiences, not as charity, but as partnership between someone with resources and someone with wisdom about how to use them meaningfully. The announcement of their engagement 6 months later surprised Vienna's social circles, who couldn't understand what a billionaire saw in a serving girl with no fortune, no connections, no obvious utility. But those who observed Victor and Leah together could see something that transcended conventional calculations of compatibility. They had found in each other what each had been missing. Victor discovered purpose and meaning that no amount of money could purchase, while Leah gained a partner whose resources could amplify her mission of preserving and sharing the stories that kept communities connected to their deepest values. Their wedding was held not in one of Vienna's grand cathedrals or luxury hotels, but in the small synagogue next to Goldene Zeit, surrounded by members of Leah's community who had become Victor's teachers in the art of living meaningfully. The ceremony was conducted in Hebrew and German, incorporating traditions that had survived centuries of persecution because people like Leah's grandmother had chosen to preserve what was sacred rather than abandon it for temporary advantage. As Victor stood beneath the chuppah, holding Leah's hands while the rabbi spoke about the sanctity of love that serves purposes larger than individual happiness, he understood that he had finally learned the difference between price and value, between wealth and worth, between having everything and possessing what actually mattered. The glass that shattered beneath his foot at the ceremony's end symbolized not destruction, but transformation, the breaking of old patterns to make space for new ways of living, loving, and understanding what it meant to be truly rich in a world that had forgotten the difference between accumulation and abundance. In the years that followed, Victor and Leah built a life together that served as proof that love could indeed transform not just individuals, but entire approaches to wealth, success, and human connection. Their publishing initiative grew into a foundation that preserved immigrant stories from across Europe. Their personal relationship became a model of how partnerships could serve purposes larger than personal happiness, and their shared commitment to values over valuations influenced business practices and philanthropic approaches far beyond Vienna's borders. But perhaps the most profound transformation was visible in Victor himself. The man who had once tried to buy a young woman's dignity with a credit card had learned that the most precious things in life could only be earned through love, service, and the daily choice to measure success not by what you accumulated, but by what you contributed to the welfare of others. Sometimes love finds us not when we're looking for it, but when we're ready to deserve it. Sometimes the greatest wealth comes not from what we gain, but from who we become in the process of learning what truly matters. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Victor's place? Would you have had the courage to change everything about your life for love? Leave your like, share with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe to our channel for more stories made with soul, emotion, and truth. And tell me also, what score from 0 to 10 would you give to this story? I'd love to know your opinion. If you love Jewish stories and learning more from this people who, despite suffering, still gave moral lessons, here is the Jewish Wisdom ebook. If you feel that this teaching resonated with you and desire to deepen your understanding, I present to you our ebook, Jewish Wisdom. This material was created based on authentic teachings from the Torah, Talmud, and Kabbalah. These are not personal interpretations, but respected sources that have been studied for generations. In this ebook, you will discover hidden truths that have been preserved for centuries. You will learn why certain practices bring blessings, how to activate spiritual protection over your life and home, and how to connect with the purpose your soul came to fulfill. This is not about dogmas. This is about transformative principles. This is not about religion. This is about awakening. Each chapter was written with the intention of guiding you toward a higher consciousness, a consciousness that does not depend on external things, but springs from the soul. We speak about spiritual cycles, sacred names, hidden codes in the Psalms, the power of words, purification of the soul, and the keys that open doors when everything seems closed. This material is for people seeking, people who know there is something more, who feel their soul calling them to awakening. The ebook Jewish Wisdom is available in digital format. You can read it from any country at any time on your phone, tablet, or computer. And if you made it this far, it's not by chance. There is a calling in your life, a divine invitation, because sometimes heaven speaks in silence, and only the attentive soul can hear. The link is in the description. True wealth is not measured by what we can afford to buy, but by what we can afford to become.